a nation proud of a past it never had. If, on one hand, France is reluctant to accept its own reality as a secondary power in geopolitical decline, on the other hand, it still manages to challenge those who bet against it. With an ability to bring instability to any corner of the world, the French have never actually managed to be the world's main power, or even the main European power. But that doesn't mean they should be underestimated, because even with all the obstacles, they still managed to become for a long time a hub of cultural export and military power projection, considerable enough to be a thorn in the side of other greater powers. Whether you like them or not, the fact is, you'll have to admit that dealing with them is quite difficult. In today's video then, we're going to talk about the geopolitics of France. But before that, don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share the video with everyone you know, because your help is very important. For the channel Geopolitical Mundial, the only true geopolitics channel in Portuguese. I'm Geopolitical Mundial and this is the channel, Geopolitical Mundial. France is a country in Western Europe. It is bordered to the southwest by the Swiss Alps and to the south by the Mediterranean Sea and Pyrenees Mountains. To the west and north by the Atlantic Ocean, to the northeast and east by the Rhine River and the Ardennes, Vosges and Jura Mountains. 95% of the French population lives in what is called metropolitan France, the original territory, and the remaining 5% are spread overseas. In the French territories still held worldwide, the French territory is mountainous on its borders and flat in the central area, still being extremely fertile land and suitable for agriculture. In addition to being traversed by 4 main rivers which are strategically positioned, the Seine River, connecting its capital, Paris, to the English Channel, and the Loire River, connecting the coastal city of Nantes to the agricultural interior of the country. The Garonne River, connecting the cities of Bordeaux and Toulouse to each other, as well as the mountainous region in the south to the Atlantic Ocean in the east, and the Rhône River, linking the city of Lyon to the Mediterranean Sea. This setup allowed for 4 very important factors: a relative geographic defensive capability provided by the mountains, protecting the country's interior from internal incursions. This made it possible for French forces to focus on just a few access points for external forces. With good agricultural capacity, and with such navigable and well-positioned rivers, they would provide easy access for their production to be shipped around the world. Access to both the Mediterranean Sea and Atlantic Ocean at the same time. This would give the French the ability to move forces relatively easily and quickly to both northern and southern Europe. And finally, the French interior, being relatively flat, contributed to the consolidation of the French nation, with few difficulties in national cohesion over several centuries. This led France to become one of the first nation-states in Europe. Thus, the French geopolitical core is consolidated from the Seine and Loire rivers, starting from the surroundings of Paris and extending towards Belgium. The French political and administrative structure has historically been based in this region because of its fertile soils, navigable rivers, and mild climate with moderate rainfall. Paris, the French capital, sits where the Seine and Marne rivers meet. Throughout modern history, the greatest threats to the French core have come from Germany, its eastern neighbor, which has waged war against France several times, mainly from the northern plain. Previously, Germanic peoples migrated from Central Europe, and the English crossed the English Channel to the north. France borders Spain and Andorra to the south, Italy to the southeast, Switzerland and Germany to the east, and Luxembourg and Belgium to the north. However, interestingly, France's longest land border is not in Europe but in South America, bordering Brazil through French Guiana. As an amphibious nation, France has often been split between focusing on land or naval power, responding to rising and shifting European threats. When its rivalry with England was more intense, it focused on its land power to reaffirm its continental bases in order to counter London. When its rivalry with Germany was more intense, it focused on its naval power. To circumvent Berlin's influence, relying on states on the edge of Europe, the French imperatives, historically, have been to expand the core to the south, from Beauce through the Rhône and Garonne. to shield its core from attacks on the northern European plain by forces from Central and Eastern Europe, to distract or manage several global or regional powers at the borders, and to be flexible in its strategies, whether in the order of its foreign policy, articulating and interacting as multilaterally as possible, without allowing itself to be tied to the interests of other states that do not also reflect its own interests, whether in its economy, with maximum diversification of its sources of wealth, or in its military, looking at the theater of operations in Europe, but on a global level. To achieve these goals, French leadership has focused on 3 interaction levels. The first is a grand strategy, which is traditionally to build a strong, centralized state that controls communication lines. Through the Rhone to the Mediterranean, create a buffer zone in the northern European plain. Create a diplomatic core, an intelligence core, and a complex colonization process to keep its many close rivals tied up in interests outside Europe. And not have any alliance that's too sacred to be broken. On a second strategic level, it's about creating a robust transportation infrastructure and resisting any attempt at regionalization. Being careful with internal groups that refuse to identify as French and that could disrupt your governance. Neutralize an excessively strong Germany by joining NATO and linking Germany to the European Union, and maintain a permanent presence abroad, ensuring that the interests of other European states can be defended by France, so that they become tied to Paris's military interests. And, at the tactical and regional level, maintain a strong internal security and intelligence capability. Create European Union institutions that still give it a broad political advantage, but also attract Germany with economic benefits in exchange for co-leadership. And establish ties with major non-European powers in order to be the point of contact for world powers in their relations with European countries. In addition, thanks to the French overseas territories, France has the second largest exclusive economic zone in the world, second only to the United States. Historically, over many centuries, France's great rivals were the English. But over time, the unification of Germany changed this balance of power in Europe, which made Paris have to get closer to London in order to maintain some level of parity with German power. Later in the Cold War, the German threat gave way to the geopolitical powers of the United States and Soviet Union, which, given their genuinely global scale of projection, would push France into a supporting role on the international stage. The French faced these two countries on the continent, which united the other nations against France and restricted its influence. And in the world, France suffered the loss of most of its possessions in a succession of independence movements fueled precisely by the United States and the Soviet Union. While the English sought more subtle, articulate, and efficient ways to maintain their sphere of influence, the French did not. They preferred to use brute force and as a result lost shamefully, seeing the 50s become their colonial nightmare. Besides, unlike the English, who maintained rather friendly relations with their former colonies, the French not only lost control but also their communication channel with former colonies, who for the most part harbored hostile feelings towards France. But, far from feeling defeated, the French simply reshaped their strategy, with France directing its focus toward the south, especially the South Atlantic and West Africa, due to its largest land border in South America. This strategy is part of a long process of French geopolitical planning. François Mitterrand, former French president, expressed this perception by stating that without Africa, France will have no place in the 21st century. What made the French use both soft power and hard power in their relations with African countries? Soft power aims to expand French culture and language in African countries, especially through investments in schools and universities that adopt the French curriculum. On the other hand, the country uses hard power to impose its interests in North Africa, West Africa, and Central Africa, often through military interventions. However, despite having strong military capabilities, the French, proud of their supposed superior culture, still cannot use this culture as a bargaining chip or as a means to expand their influence in the world. as Africa becomes a battleground for the United States, China, and Russia, and especially as it is consumed by religious conflicts that leave no room for any form of cultural influence. French, interestingly, despite being militarily weaker than other major countries like China, the United States, or even Russia, the number of French military operations abroad is practically the same. And when you take into account its relative size, that is given the difference in military capabilities in proportion, France would be the most aggressive country in the world. This aggressiveness comes from a long and old structure of French strategic thinking, of conquest during the colonial period. Because, while other nations like England and the Netherlands were guided in imperialism through a purely financial logic, or Portugal much more through a global network of trading posts than the empire itself, France, on the other hand, resorted to a colonizing process that was absurdly more aggressive and extremist, aiming for total cultural eradication and submission of the peoples in its colonies. And even with the French Revolution, supposedly inspired by the words liberty, fraternity, and equality, the French leadership maintained a very aggressive relationship with their colonies. And this explains the difference in the current relationship that England, Portugal, or even Spain have with their former colonies, compared to the relationship that France has with its own. An example of this is the fact that, while England built infrastructure, brought education, and established administrative organization to its former colonies after their independence, they were able to benefit from this English legacy. For themselves, France did not. The French practically did not build any infrastructure and left no educational or administrative legacy. This meant that their former colonies, once they became independent, were much more adrift both internationally and nationally. In short, French colonization was by far the most aggressive and the one that left the most negative consequences among the European imperial models. In terms of geopolitical power, the moment when France came closest to dominating the European stage was during the Napoleonic period. This led the continent into a period of very violent wars, generating instability with repercussions all over the world. One result was Brazil's emergence as an independent nation, because, thanks to the escape of the Portuguese royal family to Brazil, finally the structural, political, and material foundation was created that would allow Brazil to finally become a real country. After the Napoleonic period, France again sought to assert its dominance over Europe, now facing a new political rival, who for the first time would be a superior rival, within Europe, not outside it as England had been. It would be Germany that defeated her in the Franco-Prussian War of 1871. The rise of Germany as a new European player was a turning point in the French geopolitical structure, because the entire history of centuries of rivalries and disputes with England and the free geopolitical energy to project itself in the world was summarily discarded. With the birth of Germany, which for the first time forced France to cooperate on a deep level to contain threats within Europe with the Germans, now being able to permanently block France's ability to project power into the interior of the continent. However, far from bringing stability to Europe, this change only increased French frustration and aggressiveness. These frustrations and rivalries led to the greatest wars in European and world history, the First and Second World Wars. With the start of the Cold War, two factors further angered and frustrated the French Empire. First, as already mentioned, the new global scenario, dominated by the Soviet Union and the United States, sidelined the former European powers. Something that France could not accept, given the way it still saw itself as a global power. This often appeared in military actions to demonstrate its remaining power and coercion. However, a series of disastrous adventures, such as the loss of Vietnam in 1954 and the intervention in Suez in 1956, and the almost war of the lobster against Brazil in 1961, they made it clear that France was no longer a first-rate power, but rather a medium, second-rate power. The second source of anxiety was the loss of its colonies in Africa and Asia, driven mainly by the influence of the United States and the Soviet Union, which also marked the decline of France's imperial status quo. With the end of the Cold War, despite France's attempt to regain first-rate status, what actually happened was a series of new frustrations. Despite the withdrawal of the titanic nation of the Soviet Union from the international stage, new titans would emerge on the global scene, challenging French interests, such as China, India, and Turkey. For a brief moment, Brazil, and eventually the Russian Renaissance. The French simply couldn't reinsert themselves into the first category, no matter what they did, and was still intimidated by the German economic boom. Thus, Paris's strategy was a tacit agreement with Berlin. While the European Union model would give the Germans the management of the European continent in economic, fiscal, legal, administrative, or internal matters. In general, the French took on the role of defending European interests outside of Europe, especially in military and food security. This Franco-Teutonic movement was convenient for the Germans and the French, as well as for the other European countries, because it made each one's role clear. Because they could benefit from the economic stability and military strength of both, while still maintaining a minimum of sovereignty in a global scenario increasingly contested by titanic nations. Besides, it was useful for France to hide the inferiority it had after the German unification, and it was useful for Germany not to appear as a dominating power in the European Union. The French perception of a shift in the geo-economic center of gravity to the east in favor of Germany led to compensatory measures by France, related to enlargement and neighborhood priorities. In a larger European Union, diverse geopolitical priorities and security views make it hard to define European Union interests and predictability. But French aggressiveness is starting to bring risks for Europeans, especially in a deglobalized, unstable, and more hostile world. What makes it so that disagreements previously swallowed by the French and Germans are now not regurgitated by the two? The comparison of the German white papers on security policy and the future of the German army, and the French white papers on defense and national security make clear the differences in security perceptions between the two countries. In the French white paper of 2008, an arc of crisis stretching from Morocco to Afghanistan was identified, revealing the French security perception as well as France's main priorities regarding military interventions. But in the new German white paper of 2016, Russia was identified as a challenge to the European security order. Although the security perceptions of France and Germany overlap, there are therefore very important differences. When you look at the situation regarding the different geopolitical priorities of France and Germany, it becomes clear that Germany, as the central power of the European Union, is more concerned with destabilization in the Eurasian region and the Balkans, whereas France would be more concerned about the crises in North Africa and the Middle East, which, by the way, were caused by its disastrous military adventures in the region. And this divergence would get worse with the conflict in Ukraine. So the war, seen as a surprise by the French, caught Paris in such an unexpected situation. They simply don't have a deep strategy for dealing with Russia, which would frustrate and make the French even more aggressive. The main French problem isn't Russia, but their own internal dynamics. With the country receiving flows of African and Arab immigrants who, in general, are hostile to French or Western culture as a whole, in large waves, which France itself caused by disastrously intervening in North Africa and the Middle East. What makes the future and the ethnic and cultural makeup of the country be called into question? And whether this new internal reality will in fact erupt into an internal rebellion that could split the country on a level so deep that it hasn't been seen since the 8th century when Charles Martel drove the Islamic Moors out of French territory. Thank you all, I hope you enjoyed it, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel and share the video with everyone you know. Consider joining the channel as a member. Not only will you get 1 month early access to the channel's videos, but you'll also get access to exclusive videos from the live streams and full podcasts, and to my courses on this channel. Your support will keep the Geopolitical Mundial project alive. Hugs and see you in the next video.